Ready? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Mouse, the current president of the Matheson History Museum board. This is Caitlin Hoff-Mahoney, our executive director at the controls there. Really great turnout for a rainy night, don't you think? Give yourselves a hand. And it's my pleasure to introduce author and historian Dr. Kevin Kokomoor, who got his first two degrees at the University of South Florida, his PhD at Florida State. I was a double gator. We used to say Gator Bait. Maybe don't say that anymore. It's not politically correct. But anyway, his book tonight is interesting too because I'm of English background, like many Americans are, and a native of Gainesville. But his book explores a Spanish thread to early American history that is unfamiliar or even unknown to most of us. Says it's with Spanish influence and not English, which drove America's early history. By focusing on America's Spanish heritage, this collection of stories, and a good story is always great, complicates and sometimes challenges how Americans, including me, view our past. So it's going to be an interesting evening, and just a couple of administrative things. You know, we have one mic up here. Caitlin has a mic. If you have a question or if you have, a comment to make, please come up to the mic and make it. Otherwise, Dr. Kokomoor will repeat the question because we are on Zoom and it's being recorded and it'll be on the YouTube website for Matheson History Museum for everybody. That was one of the side effects of COVID. When we had to close the museum, the staff very wisely started putting everything up online. And I would also like to invite you back. You know, this Saturday, we're having our annual holiday event, which is Dashing Through History. It will be a 1 hour tour in 4 segments between 12 and 4 of this exhibit, this wonderful Great Southern Music Hall exhibit, and the one next door about language inclusivity, and also the 1857 Sarah Matheson house, which is back here. I'm not sure you all knew that, but it's the third oldest house in Gainesville. And we'll have bands on the porch. We'll have a band in here. We'll have food. There's a small charge, but it's our holiday event in conjunction with Sweetwater Branch Inn next door. And so look forward to that. Also, I want to say that this program, like many of our programs, we're a nonprofit. We're not part of the state. We're not part of the city or county government. And we depend solely on grants and on private funds and on memberships. And Willett Hancock back there, looking like a padre tonight, we'd love to sign you up to be a member of the museum so that you can get early notice of all of our programs and new exhibits. And doesn't cost much, but we sure appreciate it. The program is sponsored in part by Visit Gainesville, Alachua County, Florida, the City of Gainesville, and the Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture in the state of Florida. So yeah, we get grants. So tonight, thank you so much for coming out here, Dr. Kevin Kokomoor.
I would say that although I am a USF Bull and a Florida State Seminole and not a University of Florida Gator, the rest of my family are University of Florida Gators. So catching all that flack is something that I'm totally used to. And I will say that as a student of the early Southeast, the PK Young Library in University of Florida, I've spent a lot of time there, and it is one of the greatest collections, Spanish, Southeast, Florida. It really is a gem, and I have spent a lot of time at the University of Florida. But that being said, so I have a book here that is my first. I'm trained as a Native Americanist and someone who does the Southeast, the early Southeast, the early American Southeast. And so my first book was on Creeks, a group of them would become Seminoles. That's sort of a lot of where I come at this from, but at the same time, I wanted to write this for a a general reading audience and not necessarily, this is not necessarily an academic book. And I hope that people actually can get through it, because I know my first book, my own parents won't read it. And so and so hopefully this goes further than that. And so we have the way that I set it up, and I do say in the introduction that it can kind of be confusing until you pick up on the way it's written, because it works through several ideas: connections, origins, transformations, and legacies. Those are the 4 sections, and each section's got chapters in there, and they aren't purely chronological. Origins can pick back up where connections picked up, and so it more is about like these larger ideas, the idea of the connections between Florida and Spanish colonialism elsewhere, the origins that would draw people here or that created firsts, transformations, the way that the Spanish presence transformed the Southeast, and then legacies, some examples that you can see in the modern day Southeast, and definitely in modern day Florida, that you can trace directly back to this period of Spanish colonialism. So it doesn't try to replace an early history of any other group, because the colonial Southeast of it is a very complicated place with a lot of colonial native African influences. But the point of this is really to show how the Spanish affected, the Spanish influenced. And I would say, and I make a point to say in the introduction of the book, and I'll make it a point to say in the introduction, that no way in no attempt here to glorify any of this, right? By transformation, we're talking about a really violent thing that happens to the Southeast, right? When we talk about the Catholic origins, those aren't, this isn't necessarily a good thing. And so we'll have to keep people in mind, or keep it in mind that when we talk about some of this stuff, I'm not talking about it in like a triumphant way, because that's where this book comes from, is the idea of the first Thanksgiving being this really neat triumphant story of pilgrims that land in Massachusetts, and next thing you know, you have the United States of America, and it's all a very successful story. So we're trying to get outside of that box, and this is an example of doing that. But I don't want to do that by making the Spaniards out to be great people, because by 21st century standards, they're not great people. So, right, we will move along. And this is the theme that I have for you today. It is a theme that plays its way through the book. Is anyone familiar with this? This is William Bartram. By the way, this is at the American Philosophical Society, where I first saw it in like 2012, one of the first grants I ever got. And it's about the size of that. I mean, it is huge. And that is a painting of the great Alachua Savanna. As we know now, Payne's Prairie. So in the purest sense of tying all of these great grand themes of transformation, origins, connections, I point to something that's right on the edge of where we stand right now, which is Payne's Prairie, or known by William Bartram in 1773 as the Great Alachua Savanna. A level, plain green, above 15 miles over, 50 miles in circumference, and scarcely a tree or bush of any kind. I wish it wasn't dark and rainy when I was just driving on 75 on the way here, but you just can't miss it. You always know you're about to pop into Gainesville because of that. It's still just, you can imagine it. You can, I mean, don't close your eyes because you're driving on the interstate, but you can imagine that it basically is the exact same that it was, right, when he was there in 1774. So we'll get into that later. But the point here is tying all of this to one place. That place has all of these themes in it. And so we'll start with connections. And the connections I talk about in the book are basically the way that Florida was connected to first Spanish colonialism in the Caribbean. Think Juan Ponce de Leon, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon. Those are the, I wouldn't call them, Juan Ponce de Leon would have liked to have been a conquistador, but he doesn't last very long in Florida. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon has a very close connection to where I teach right now in South Carolina, because that's where he attempts San Miguel de Guadalupe, I believe, and both fail. But what we have here is the moving through, not to not so much Pamphile de Narvaez, because he sort of like, takes a left and has to push out on these rafts, and that's just a horror story. It's fantastic if you ever wanted to read it. The real big one is Hernando de Soto. And so again, the general idea of today, and I'm not really used to, so if I'm shaking, I apologize, but this is the area that we're talking about. De Soto moves directly through. He starts in Macosa territory, which is Tampa Bay, moves through Ocala territory, which is Ocala, moves through Patano, which is the western edge of what would be known as Timucua. Right. Then he moves west into Appalachia, and that's sort of his Florida stretch. And it is a devastating stretch. It is not as devastating as what would happen over here with the Battle of Mavila, but over here, Napatuca, I mean, there are several massacres in the panhandle of Florida. In a long list of De Soto treating the native people as something to be exploited. And that's the connection, is that Juan Ponce de Leon comes to Florida thinking that it's another island in the Caribbean after he's hopscotched its way through every one of the Bahamian islands, after having snatched every human being off the Bahamian Islands until there are literally no more human beings on the Bahamian Islands, because he is doing this to raid islands for Native American slaves to bring back to Hispaniola. And he thinks that the next island is right here. And it turns out that there is something right there, but it's a continent, right? And so that's where he lands. Same thing with Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, lands right here, because if you think about sailing from the Caribbean through the Bahamas, what's your next step? It's obviously going to be Florida. Well, here, right? Hernando de Soto is second under command of the Pizarro brothers, and he is in Peru. And he becomes fabulously wealthy in Peru. But by the time that he comes back, right, you have Pamphile de Narvaez has died, but they write down all of these civilizations that have mound structures, they have godlike chieftains. Everything makes sense to a guy who has already become fabulously wealthy by toppling kingdoms. And so he says, even though I am insanely wealthy, I will mortgage everything on this trip into this unknown land, because it doesn't matter if they die or not. Everyone talks about mound structures. Everyone talks about hierarchical societies. And in his brain, that equals gold and silver, and that equals incredible wealth. And that's why when he goes here, he says, where's the gold? 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 Show me the gold. That's the only thing he wants to know. And if people are smart enough and they get him out of there without a tremendous amount of violence, then they're lucky, because that's usually not what happens, right? So even De Soto, this is the connection. De Soto is here because he wants a bigger piece of what he has already had, and he thinks he's going to find it here. And he, looking for that, moves right through this area in north central Florida, the Patano, which is a extreme western part of the Timucua. And he moves through on his way to Appalachia. Appalachia, he stays over the course of the winter until he's basically kicked out under a hail of arrows, and he moves on into his Georgia stretch. And so we have this area right here, the Patano, being a spot, being subject to Hernando de Soto. We know that he moves directly through this place because it is a chieftain. It's not a big one, but it is a Timucua chieftain, and he thinks that there are gold mines there. And obviously there aren't gold mines there, right? But that's what he's looking for. So we have the connection here is we won't say, discovery in air quotes. We'll say the attempted colonization of Florida is an attempt for him to replicate successes elsewhere. That's the first time that we cross paths. The second time that we cross paths, that's under, I guess I don't have it there. That's under origins. And the origins here, when I break down origins, first I have a chapter on slavery and the slave trade, which basically talks about, and the Native American slave trade, which is once you have basically annihilated the Northern Caribbean, what's next? The Southeast. And again, that gets to Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon and Juan Ponce de Leon. But then you have the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church sees these natives and says they are souls to be saved here. And so again, if we're focusing on the larger area around the Alachua Savannah, right, we move through Macoso, Ocala, Patano, right there. There's the route of De Soto, the Ustaga, then Appalachia. And so here's his route, goes right through the area. These will be the homes of no less than 4 Spanish missions, some of which will exist for decades, some of which are very, very difficult to even find in the primary record. We know that Buenaventura is probably gone by 1613, 1614, but we know that San Francisco de Patano is the first doctrina that is west of the St. John's River. So while the Spanish are moving west into, you know, what we now know as like these really dense Appalachian mission districts, they hit these areas first. And a doctrina means it's not temporary. If it was a visita, or if it was, that means that you have an itinerant preacher, like basically a circuit riding friar who would go there once every couple months or once a month. A doctrina is a permanent facility with a church, a convent, and so they set up missions. There are missions here right in Gainesville, right on the Alachua Savannah, to preach, to baptize, to the Patano. And that is a connection to this origin, is that what will bring Spaniards here, even after everyone knows that there is no gold to be had? Well, the church gets involved. They want to have a large, hierarchical, densely populated native society that they can missionize, because that is happening in New Spain, which is, modern day Mexico. That's happening in the Viceroyalty of Peru. They want to have that here in La Florida, and this is their chance. So they move into this area. And this area is really well known for a document that is basically created out of these missions. The Timucua language. This is a confessional guide, because you can't partake of mass unless you confess. You can't confess if you don't know Spanish. This is actually an incredible piece of ethnography. Francisco Pareja, I believe, is the friar, and he produces, he can speak Timucua and he writes it down. And I think at UC Riverside, her name is Alejandra Dubkovsky, has actually got this huge grant project working on basically recreating the Timucua language. And really, the only documents that we have are some of these documents produced by Pareja. And what you have here are a breakdown of Castilian Spanish to the native language. The guy learned the native language so that he could better serve his converts, his prospective converts. And so here are parts of the confessional, and I was supposed to look up the 10 Commandments before I got here, so you guys are going to have to help me. I'm pretty sure I know them, but put me on the spot. I might get it wrong, so we'll see. Have you defeated someone by stealth? Have you lied in games? Did you count more points? This is for the ball game, which is really huge in the Southeast. What have you won by cheating must be returned to its owner, since something badly won is like something stealing. So 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal. This is a confessional based off the 10 Commandments and the 7 deadly sins. Have you played so long that you have lost all you had, right? That, gambling. If the answer is yes, this is a confessional. These are confessional questions, right? And so this is ball game. This is not terrible stuff just yet. Have you believed that some dreams will come true? Having seen or heard some animal of the forest that sings or that does something else, have you believed in some omen or that some evil will come? Have you believed that some possessed? Have you believed that which? That's a mouthful, but you get the idea. What is this one? That's the first. The Lord God is the only God. That's what they said. Here, what you have right here, this is starting to get more existentially, culturally, religiously problematic, because in the native Southeast and then the native Northeast, and among the Algonquins, they would refer to as Manitou. The idea that you live in an incredible, unknowable, violent, wonderful world, and that there are forces that influence everything all the time. And that the only way that you can understand this is to try to understand all these forces. There are shamans that use tobacco, they use early hallucinogenics. They try to interpret the will of the universe. And everything means something. that you have to interpret or that people interpret for you. This Eastern woodland idea is based, I mean, it is under assault here, right? I mean, this is heretical. This challenges shamans, faith healers. This is an attempt to replace them. Now we're starting to get a little more contested. This is just, don't cheat. This is everything that you know about the world around you is wrong, and you are satanic devil worshippers. That's where we're getting here, right? Then we have, right? This is for women. Did you desire someone? Did you desire some of your kin? Have you consented that some of them kiss you? Have you decorated yourself with evil intent so that someone desires you and has you? Have you had intercourse with someone? Was he married? Was he single? How many single? Which, like, now you're starting to get into someone's personal business. By the way, these are just examples. I mean, there are all sorts of questions like this, which would, I mean, you are sitting in a confessional and a guy is asking you about your sex life, essentially. Right. And we know that that Native Americans don't have the same. I mean, I'm putting this vaguely and hopefully, I mean, it's not early Catholic values. Right. So the general idea is this stuff starts to become really problematic because this is an assault on your culture. This is an assault on your religion. Right. And this document was created right around this area because Martin Prieto is the first, and then you have this Francisco Pareja, and he basically writes this. This is incredibly popular. This is a model that is used everywhere, a model to learn the language so that you can basically get in with the native people so that you can then better proselytize. This is the Franciscan model. This is what separates them from the Dominicans who just absolutely get wiped out. And this is problematic. Right? This is one of the reasons why there is such a native demographic collapse here. This is one of many things that is definitely wrong with this place and time. First off, we have the missions. All of the food that is feeding the missions is grown by the native population, right? They are assaulting your culture and your religion in every way possible. At the same time, they are insisting that you move closer and closer together into reducciones, right? Towns, mission towns. And the mission towns are located next to all of these European, we'll call it old world animals like pigs and chickens and goats that they want you to learn how to use because you can't be civilized unless you act civilized, right? And we know what happens when people get in close proximity to pigs and chickens and livestock. They get sick. And these are the vectors of demographic collapse in these missions. I mean, it's not, I mean, there's an immediate collapse of like 30, 40%, and then it's just a slow drain all the time because these missions are always bringing in new people. These are constant vectors of disease. Even, even pigs. I mean, something is great. Like pigs get us sick. Everyone, like flus, right? And chickens. These natives have no history with domesticated animals, so they have no history of these diseases, and they are just absolutely devastating. If you take away the cultural assault that Spaniards are performing, that's enough. Then at the same time, Patanos are required to carry 75 pounds in corn to St. Augustine on their backs, and that'll kill you. We know that haciendas, that's a rural estate based off of Native American labor. These are popping up in Patano towns, on the outskirts of Patano towns. And here's another connection where we continue to build, is that this is the connection where we get cattle. Right? I mean, you can imagine the scene of a cattle ranch as being a chaotic, bloody. I mean, there's no refrigeration. So that has to be done quickly. It has to be packed in salt quickly. It involves a huge population of native workers. It is incredibly bloody and nasty. And there is everything to be produced: hides, beef, choice cuts of beef that are then immediately sold into St. Augustine, beef that is salted, hides that are tanned, tallow that is made. I mean, everything is made on these. These two systems right here are really the first two systems of unfree labor in the New World generally, right? That is a labor draft. It's better than the encomienda system only in name. The encomienda system is ownership of land and everything on that land, including people. The repartimiento system basically says there is a revolving native labor draft. You either carry corn into St. Augustine, you build the fortifications of St. Augustine, or you ranch out on these lands. And the combination of all of these leads to, and I don't want to like beat you guys over the head with a huge slide, so I apologize about this one, right? It leads to real problems. The Timucua Rebellion, 1656, rises up, burns most of the missions down, and within 8 months, the Spanish have burned every Timucua town, including Patano towns. And when the Patano towns are annihilated, more estancias move in, more haciendas, more cattle ranches. Then you have outbreaks constantly because of what we talked about beforehand. We know of outbreaks as early as 1613. So Spanish missions are in this region by about the turn of the 17th century, 1600s. So by 1613, we have smallpox, yellow fever. I mean, these are devastating. You got to think like 20, 30, 40, 50% of the alive population is wiped out in every one of these. So we know that the larger Timucua population by the turn of the 18th century has gone from 20,000 to 2,000. And the Patano are part of the Timucua. So we know the Patano go from maybe 3,000 to 4,000 down to about 100. There are 100 living outside of San Francisco de Patano, or, with the mission, San Francisco. So now we're starting to talk about transformations. By the way, also legacies. What Spaniards bring in to these haciendas will become the bloodline of what we now know as the piney woods, the scrub, and the cracker cattle. Which I know cracker is kind of like it's touch and go. We have this name cracker, but that's in the Nature Conservancy and the Livestock Conservancy. That is these are all, they're referred to as criollo cattle, right? They are the American descendants of cattle that came from somewhere else, right? And in this case, retentas and Berendas, these are Andalusian, right? What we have is the Texas Longhorn, the Corriente, the Criollo. These are all Spanish cattle that are brought over. These are the Spanish cattle that will become the cattle of ranches like Lechua, which is a massive ranch, probably literally right where we're standing. Right? It is the largest of like 24 cattle ranches. And again, those cattle ranches represent this, right? This is exploited, terrible work. And there are tens of thousands of head of cattle here. The Lechua Ranch is only one of dozens, well, 24. And it's got thousands of head of cattle on its own. And these cattle are the cattle that we now know as the cattle in Florida, the Livestock Conservancy protected cattle. I'll get more to this later when we're just cruising along on the stories. Everybody see where I'm getting at? Everyone's following along. I'm not rambling too much. So the free range tradition, I mean, barbed wire isn't invented for like another 200 years, so you don't really have an option, right? Texas Longhorns have really big horns. These scrub cattle have really small horns because this place is in the open plains of Texas, and if you had 4-foot wide horns, you would get stuck in something and die. And so that's why, I mean, that's literally an example, right? This is why we still use some of these scrub cattle as bloodlines, because they are insanely heat resistant and disease resistant. And they have nice small little horns that don't get hung up in Brazilian peppers now, unfortunately, right? So all of this stuff leads to the destruction of the Patana, is the point, when we're starting to move into transformations. The last, which, we could write books about and just talk for days about, is the fact that by the time you get to 1670, you have the South Carolinians have popped up here, and they hate, right, the Spaniards in Florida. And during any war, they use the outbreak of war to basically send their native allies south, and they just annihilate Spanish Florida. And Spanish Floridians make such easy targets because the Spaniards keep them huddled together in mission towns. They are horribly unprotected by the Spanish 300 or 400 soldiers that are there. And the Spanish don't allow them to carry weapons because they're good farming churchgoers. They're not hunters, right? They're trying to civilize them. And these frontier groups, right? These groups that are going through this incredible transformation themselves, they are just absolutely annihilating these mission districts. And so when we have these old maps, this comes from the South Carolina perspective. And I'll step away. I guess I can do this. We'll see if this works. This is this moment we talked about, right? If you look at this map of Carolina, 1711, this is made by Thomas Nairn. He's one of the most legendary South Carolina slave raiders that ever existed. He gets tortured to death in like 1715, so he gets his sooner or later, but not until he single-handedly just depopulates Florida. I mean, almost single. I mean, so if you zoom in into this area, it says right here, right? The road of the Ocheezes going to make war with the Floridians. And by Floridians, he means the native Floridians. And then here it says, here the Carolina Indians leave their canoes when they go to war with the Floridians. I mean, the South Carolinians are so good at this, they put it on their maps. And then we have this next one from 1750. I'm sorry, I won't hit that again. I'm surprised I didn't fall. We have 1750, the Appalachia are up here. And then again, if you see Timucua down here, and if I zoom in, and it says, Timucua, destroyed by the Carolinians in 1706. There's San Francisco. I mean, like they are literally putting that right on top of where the Potano used to be. Does that make sense? I mean, they're gone now. The survivors fled to either Pensacola or St. Augustine. Nothing else is safe. Appalachia is destroyed. The major mission district there is destroyed. And so you have this crazy era of almost complete demographic collapse. That's only part of the story, though, right? Because I point to some academic books that I read, I had to read, but I enjoyed them. And we call this area the Mississippian Shatter Zone because between disease and the destabilization of the slave trade, I mean, everything changes. Everything changes. Everything that was there is blown apart and people are left to regroup, which is why when I say from Chickasaw to Chickasaw, you know, the play on that is that is the Mississippian spelling. That's the spelling that you know now as the modern spelling, how that people changed. Well, there's no from Potano to Potano. That is one of the stories of the Savannah, the Alachua Savannah that totally transforms. Because, right, we know now that even though there is incredible destruction and depopulation, what we have is William Bartram, which is the quote from earlier. He takes a tour all throughout the Southeast, from Charleston down to, you know, South Savannah, and it's fantastic. And he ends up in Cuscahuia, which is a Native American town, like literally right here on the north edge of the Savannah. And he hangs out there, and he has an absolute blast. It's one of his favorite places. Half of his memoirs are written about this place. It's fantastic. And he says, Seminoles abdicated the ancient Alachua town on the borders of the Savannah, ancient Indian fields now grown over with forests of stately trees, orange groves, and luxuriant herbage. As almost every step we take over these fertile heights discovers remains and traces of ancient human habitations and cultivation. What he's saying is that might be a swamp, but you can see when you're driving on 75, the high ground around it is high ground around it, right? And he says you can't walk around the high ground without basically hitting something that clearly somebody lived here a long time ago, but now they don't anymore. Who do you think he's referring to? It's probably the Potano. He's not talking about Seminoles. He actually says the Seminoles see this too, and they don't want to have anything to do with it, right? They created Cuscahuia in a new place. He says you visit Cuscahuia, and then you walk around the Savannah, and almost every step, there is some sort of evidence that somebody lived there, and now it's overgrown. So what we know is, when you look at a map of where DeSoto goes, you see Potano, you see Appalachia, you see these names right here, Acute, Cofitachiqui, Chiscas, Tally, Coosa, Mobila. That's a really bad one right there. That's about 8,000 people die right there. But what you don't see is Seminole. What you don't see is Creek. What you don't see is Chickasaw or Choctaw or Cherokee, even though that's clearly Cherokee land. That's clearly Creek land. That would be Choctaw and Chickasaw. There's Chickasaw, but it's spelled Chicasaw. C-A-Z-A. That's the pre-Columbian. That's the only one that you can. What happens is we have these two things go on. They're both anthropological terms. Ethnogenesis is basically the creation of an identity. And coalescence is the recombining of groups into an identity. And what we think happens is that all of these forces, whether it's the Soto going through here, the Spanish are in Pensacola now, they're in St. Augustine, their presence so disorients this Native American world that it basically begins to fall apart. And we don't even know how many people die of disease, but we know that these places don't exist, and these places now do exist. And those are coalescent. Those are the second generation of natives of the Southeast. They are the refugee groups that come together and they create new identities, right? So these are relatively recent. And all of them have origin stories about how we lived somewhere and came somewhere else, and there was death. And these are the survivors of this period of transformation. And so I don't want to get triumphant about it, but the period of transformation that we talk about is one of incredible depopulation and physical destruction, but also it creates new identities. And one of the craziest identities is Seminoles, because Seminoles literally mean runaways, right? Or people who live at a distance, or people who camp elsewhere. Seminoles are Creeks, right? Seminoles come from Creek country, and they migrate down slowly into the Panhandle, and they end up on the Flint River in the Panhandle. They end up around Tallahassee, and a large group of them ends up right there. And why do you think that is? They are moving south further and further into hunting areas that no one has hunted for 100 years. And what are they finding? Right? They find all sorts of animals. And you know what they also find? Tens of thousands of cows. Why? Because the Spanish missions are gone. The ranches are gone, all destroyed during these wars. The natives are gone. They are repopulating an area that was once developed and then basically destroyed. And so what you have is, right, this comes from Bartram. When he's on the savannah, when he's on Payne's Prairie, he says there's freaking cows everywhere. You can't not listen to them move, right? And then what he says, again, it's a long quote. He says, herds of sprightly deer, squadrons of the beautiful fleet Seminole horses, flocks of turkeys, civilized communities of cranes, which sonorous. I don't know if anyone's hung out with sandhill cranes, but I wouldn't. Like, sonorous is one way to put it. They're beautiful, but man, they don't sound beautiful. But right, the enjoyment mixed together, appearing happy and contented in the enjoyment of peace, till disturbed and affrighted by the warrior man. Behold yonder, coming up upon them through the darkened groves, sneakingly and unawares, the naked red warrior invading the Elysian fields of Alachua. At the terrible appearance of the painted, fearless, uncontrolled, and free Seminole, the peaceful, innocent nations, and again, by nations, we're talking about animals, right, are at once thrown into disorder and dismay. See the different tribes and bands, how they draw towards each other, as it were deliberated upon the general good. Suddenly they speed off with their young in the center, but the roebuck fears and not. Here he lays a blah, 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 right? The red warrior, I'm obviously incredibly anachronistic and problematic, but whose plumed head flashes lightning, whoops in vain, his proud, ambitious horse, strains and pants. The earth glides from under his feet. His flowing mane whistles in the wind. What they're talking about is Seminole horsemen. And what Bartram basically says is Seminoles are the best horsemen you've ever seen. Seminoles are like the Comanche before anyone knew that Comanche existed, of European origin, right? Because no one had moved that far out west yet, right? What you're talking about is a Native American people who have gotten very, very good at hunting cows on horses, right? They are, by the way, right? These are your first cowboys. They are slaves. They're either Native American or of African descent, but those are your first cowboys because they are working cattle ranches in 1590. Before this is a long time ago, right? So before there is the Civil War and the great Texas Range Wars, you have cowboys working in Florida, right? And if they are your first ones, then these are your second ones. And in fact, Bartram, I had this in my introduction, they treat him to one incredible beef barbecue. He is there, and they say we're having this big meeting in the council house. And he says, soon after sunrise, a party of Indians on horseback appeared upon the savannah to collect together several herds of cattle, which they drove along near our camp towards the town. One of the party came up and informed us that the cattle belonged to the chief of Cuscahuia, that he had ordered some of the best steers of his droves to be slaughtered for a general feast. It's one of your first barbecues, by the way. I don't argue that it's the first, because DeSoto was there for the first. That was pork, because he brought all pigs with him. But that's a pretty important seculum. I mean, that's like, when you think of beef barbecue, you think of Texas, not so much, right? It's actually Seminole, right? So we still have these huge rallies, these huge jamborees down on the Big Cypress Reservation, and they still do gigantic beef barbecues, right? And what you have is, by the way, the chief of Cuscahuia, that's his name. We think he might be Sakafi. They think he might be Ahaya. But everyone back in the day, I think the Seminole, and this is the Spanish pronunciation of the Seminole, would be Wakapachizi, which in Seminole literally means he who owns cows, right? So he is the cow keeper. That's his identity, right? So we know that Seminoles are, I mean, they wouldn't, why would you move down here? Why would you come into this place? Because the further and further you are moving south, everything gets better and better. There is no European presence there. Yeah, the Spanish are in St. Augustine, but I mean, really, are they there? Not really, right? They are no threat to you. Georgia is starting to scare you in the 1750s. South Carolina has already caused several wars in the 1600s and 1700s. There is nothing to fear here. All there are ownerless herds of cows, deer, white-tailed deer as far as the eye can see. This place, I mean, like, he refers to it as Elysium, and you're like, I get that. This is like heaven, right? And so what you have is, in the 1740s and the 1750s, the Alachua band of Seminoles is basically, you can tie their ethnogenesis to a movement south from Creek country in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s. And at some point, they stay there long enough that people start calling them runaways. And the term for runaway in Spanish is cimarrone, Seminole. That's where that term comes from. Why would they run away and not come back? Why would you come back? Hmm? It's paradise. By the way, I mean, you can read this, and he's like an artist. Everyone actually calls him Pug Puggy, flower catcher, which is a pretty cool name, actually. But he's a naturalist. He's one of those guys that paints flowers, and gets to name them because he's the first one that does it, right? So he's obviously got some art in this. He flowers it up a lot. But yeah, you can soak some of that in and be like, if you would imagine the beauty of the Payne's Prairie now, imagine what it was like 200 years ago. I mean, it was probably almost unbelievable, right? And in fact, if you look at the prairie, you have to zoom in, but there's storks and there's animals. It's just that's an epic painting, right? So what we get at are these legacies. Even if we talk about the non-native legacies, we know that especially after Vicksburg, and I get off topic a little bit, but after Vicksburg, when the Confederates lose access to Texas, they immediately look to Florida. And Florida cattle become incredibly lucrative because no one owns them, and no one lives in Florida in the 1760s below Gainesville, right? And they have moved down into these savannas north of the lake, right? And like what you would now consider to be like Arcadia, right? And so all you have to do is go get them. I mean, these are the early cattle drives. Frederick Remington, 1890s, writes about the cracker cowboy in like Polk City, in Arcadia in the Peace River Valley. This is this cowboy Florida heritage is only because of Spanish retentas and verandas that they brought 400 years ago, and that after they were destroyed, the cows stayed, and the cows are there, and they're actually quite. So you have and the Great Florida Cattle Drive begins in Live Oak, right? And it's just an homage to this heritage of cattle driving. Well, in Big Cypress they do the same thing. In Big Cypress, the Seminole tribe of Florida has a cattle program, and they have several drives a year, right? So this is our connection, right? The Seminoles, they are cattle people. By the way, the cowkeeper dies in about 1783, 1784. And usually with natural lineages, it doesn't go to your son because your son doesn't share the same natural lineage connection that you do because he shares the natural lineage of your wife because matrilineage moved through the mother's side. So he wouldn't be sharing power directly with his paternal son. It would be with his nephew who runs through the mother's side. And so we think this is the way it goes. Cowkeeper in about 1783 gives it off to Paine, who dies when Americans invade in 1812. And it's really ironic. I don't want to get like, anti-colonialist or anything, but right to the east of here is Noonan's Lake. And David Noonan killed Paine, right, in 1812. And yeah, Paine, when he dies, goes to Bowlegs. He's around. That's when Andrew Jackson invades in 1818, 1819. We don't really, pretty sure that he dies in that invasion as well. So Andrew Jackson kills him. It devolves to his nephew, Micanopy, who obviously is just south of here, south of the town of the same name. And then it goes to Billy, who gets removed in like 1858. So you have this incredible generation of Seminole leadership, which basically, these are the Seminoles by the way. The Seminoles that you know as the unconquered Seminoles derive mostly. The crazy thing about Seminoles is now academically, I mean, it's hard to even call them all Seminoles because they were so unique that they had so little contact or interest in what each group was doing. When one would remove, another one would say, we got nothing to do with that, right? So this group right here can claim that they never signed a peace treaty, and you could say that they probably didn't. But that group right there is the group that ends up south of the lake, so far deep in the Everglades that the American army just stops looking for them. And guess who pops up right there? That's Payne's Prairie. Payne's Prairie is named after a Seminole, right? That's not a coincidence. So again, obviously I'm concluding, but right, we have the connections. What are the connections? DeSoto, Juan Ponce de Leon. Florida is going to be the next conquest, which will make everyone rich. It'll either make you rich because you're going to steal the people there or you're going to find gold there, right? That doesn't work. Origins. After that doesn't work, we have the origins clearly of the Catholic Church comes in and sets up all of these missions. And these missions slowly but steadily drive the Patano absolutely insane. And it is the source, the single steadiest source of demographic collapse, which in transformations, right? This leads to the identity of Seminoles because Seminoles don't coalesce in Florida. I mean, I guess you could say they did. They coalesce first as Creeks in Georgia, and then they coalesce again as Seminoles in Florida because of everything that was left behind during this period. And we still see, again, just the legacy of Seminoles. The legacy of Seminoles in Big Cypress Reservation in Brighton, right around the Okeechobee, began on the Alachua Savannah. So very, very few times. By the way, you know what I haven't even talked about? Orange trees. Apparently there were orange trees all over the place around here, right? That's also Spanish. I don't have enough time to, go into that. I'm probably over already, but he basically says, I think it's in the very first, so I'm not going to go back, but he basically says there's orange groves all over the place. Well, Spanish bring oranges here. Right, so the Alachua Savannah, the Bartrams are absolutely obsessed with oranges. They're not the sweet oranges; they're like Seville. I forget what kind they are, but they're the really bitter ones that you would make mojo out of. But if you go back into the history of orange cultivation, they would use the rootstock and graft a weaker orange literally to Florida rootstock, right? And Sir Francis Drake comes in 1587 and just burns the whole place down in St. Augustine, cuts every orange tree down, and they just keep growing right back up, right? And so they're hardy, they're survivors. And just like the Criollo of Florida were used to reestablish like different breeds like Brahmas or Angus. Well, it's not going to be perfect, but if you breed an Angus with a Criollo, he's going to survive, right? The same thing if you breed a nice sweet orange onto the rootstock of a bitter one, it's the best of both worlds. But right, legacies. I'm talking about barbecue too, but we won't get into that. But all of it on the Alachua Savannah. And I think that'll do it. I think we'll move to questions. Thanks. I know I kind of surprised you there on that. I should have done a better rap. That was it. So yes, questions.
All right. So the microphone questions does have a cord, so you will need to come up. I don't know if I can condense this question, but I'm just curious. So after the invasion from the English and the Allies, like why then nothing? Why did no one come here for a while?
Well, it only takes about 30 years. The Spanish do exist. They still exist in Pensacola. They still exist in St. Augustine. And so we know the worst raids that really devastated those missions in general about 1706. And after you have the complete destruction of these native populations, not complete, but pretty devastating. There's a lot of stuff that happens in South Carolina as well. There is this huge war called the Yamasee War that explodes, and it basically completely reorients the Southeast for like 10 or 15 years. It is a really devastating war. I guess the answer to your question is it doesn't take that long. We know that Seminoles start moving in, we think, in about the 1730s. So you have about a 25-year period there. We know that natives raid down there consistently up until about 1711. By about 1711, 1712, 1713, they're getting all the way down to the Calusa, almost to the Keys, which is really impressive. I mean, it's scary, but the raiding goes on until this huge. This is the best answer I can give you. I'm not entirely sure, but this war that completely racks. It's a devastating war that racks the entire Southeast. And it is it more or less it doesn't destroys an ultimate term, but it devastates the Yamasee, the Westo, all of these groups that you would call on the frontier. They don't really obtain a lot of power anymore. They either move closer to Charleston or they move closer to St. Augustine. I guess it just naturally takes that long for Creeks to basically coalesce as a people and then just to begin slowly moving down. The whole reason they're slowly moving down is because they're having to go further and further to get deerskin, because that's the major trade after the Indian slave trade. And obviously that's unsustainable. And so they have to keep moving further and further and further. Well, if you're Creek, if you move further to the west, then you're at war with the Choctaw. If you move further to the northwest, then you're at war with the Chickasaw. Slowly moving down into Florida is the only place that you can expand and not go to war with someone. So I guess you can imagine that as just a slow process, is the best answer I can give you. She's a warrior. I have one myself.
So I've noticed that the peak of the Spanish mission system in the late 1600s coincides with the crisis of the Spanish monarchy. So I was wondering if you think that's a coincidence or if there's some kind of connection between those.
I know that, I'm not totally sure that I see a connection there. I know that, when did the Jesuits get expelled? 1670? Maybe? Yeah, so there is a shakeup, but Franciscans don't really see that sort of violence on behalf of the state. And I know that in the 1650s and the 1660s, the French Huguenots are such a threat to colonization and proselytization that whatever I don't see that. I know that there are, like, Queen Anne's War is what kicks off really the destruction of the missions in the early 18th century. I mean, that's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that, but if I'm just thinking off the top of my head, it doesn't seem like that shakes up the missions. In fact, in the 1670s and 1680s, there's a lot of forces that come together that save St. Augustine. A couple really bad pirate raids into St. Augustine and into the larger Caribbean convinced the Spanish government that they need to invest in Florida, which is where you get the Castillo de San Marcos. That starts in like the 1680s. We know that the Spanish missions hit their, I guess you could say, the glory period in the 1670s and 1680s. These are the times where Franciscans are showing the Spanish government why Florida is worthwhile. So these are just my thoughts, but off the top of my head, I don't see it in the documents that it threatens them.
I'm Lawrence Walker. I'm a protege of Mike Gannon, the seminal historian of Spanish Florida. I want to ask you, do you think it's distinctive that Florida was finally colonized by the Spanish after the period of what we call the New Laws and Bartolome de las Casas and and the debate about what he did, do you think that had an impact that made the settlement of Florida for the Spanish less probably general saddled than what happened in the 1500s elsewhere?
Encomiendas in Florida. By the time that there's an attempt, to really succeed in Florida, the encomienda system has given way, and the encomienda system was really the trustee ownership of people by encomenderos for their Catholicization, which obviously doesn't happen. They just abuse them, and so there are these changes, like the laws of Burgos, and then the new laws, 1512, 1540s. I mean that does take place, but they had tried. I mean, so the history of the colonization of Florida goes. I mean, there were probably no less than a half dozen attempts that have reflected different periods in the church's interaction with natives. I know that there's chapters where when Juan Ponce de Leon lands, I mean, he probably has a copy of the requirement in his hand, which he's supposed to read, which basically says you'll become good Catholics or we'll destroy every one of you, and that reflects this first idea that you are basically a Catholic positive violence, is that you are savages, and that's only because you haven't had the opportunity to learn the faith. And if we give you the opportunity to learn the faith and you reject it, then you become infidel, and then we can make war on you. That reflects the church at that time. By the time La Florida actually exists, by the time some sort of colonization long-term exists in the 1560s and 70s, the church position has changed rapidly, and it's more about the saving of souls. And so does that answer your question? There is a change that has taken place over time. It is no longer about, the whole point of the requirement was setting a condition that natives could never meet. And it's just a legitimization of war, right? You can't make war on Christians, so you make sure that they never become Christians, and then you can make war on them, right? And so, I mean, it's spoken in a language they don't even understand. So it's it's funny that you say Bartolome de las Casas, because Bartolome de las Casas writes Florida into the destruction of the Indies. It has a chapter there. In fact, this in one of the chapters of my book, where in Florida everybody talks about the legend of Juan Ponce de Leon, and he's there for the Fountain of Youth. He never said anything about that, right? That is the myth of a myth over time. What we do know is that he is there, and he is holding a capitulacion, right, that basically says that I can enslave people and read them a requirement. And the Fountain of Youth sounds a whole lot better than that when you tell that to the kids in school. And what we also know is that there are several generations. I mean, it does change over time, but the first generations previous to those laws, they were incredibly brutal. Oh, about Bartolome de las Casas. He talks about Juan Ponce de Leon, and he talks about Hernando de Soto. So he puts them in there. He says they met their sticky end in Florida. So he was not a fan of the conquistadors. It's a short chapter, but it's a good one.
I have to go back and look at it again. I missed that chapter. But I understand that toward the later time, the bigger problem were the people who wanted to exploit the Indians, just get so much labor, like trying to raise wheat around the Alcilla River, and that didn't work out. But they were a long way from Spain, so they thought they could get away with it. And that brought a lot of
that is an important. Yes, there are laws on the books.
But the other.
Yeah. So the gentleman was just remarking that even though, I mean, the exploitation, it's illegal, but you're on the other side of the world where it takes a year to send a document back to Spain and back. I mean, who is going to enforce the new laws, right? I mean, this is just not. It's just not the way it works. And I laugh in my class and I say, wherever Spaniards go, they bring olives, wheat, and wheat, and grapes. And grapes don't work so well in Florida, and wheat didn't work so well in Florida. Nothing worked really well in Florida, but they tried wheat, because obviously you can't anoint without olive oil. You can't have mass without wheat and grapes. They take them absolutely everywhere. And in the book, we basically say that after a couple battles where they lose these big bags of wheat flour that they literally carry with them, and you got to think about how problematic that would be, right? Just carrying wheat everywhere. Of course, they made natives carry it until they dropped dead, and that's part of the origins. But when they lost all that wheat, they literally had conversations amongst themselves about whether to create flour out of corn, and they refused to do it because it wasn't wheat. I mean, that's how they said, we'd rather not have bread than have bread made out of heathen corn. And so that, like, yeah, they tried wheat. They tried wheat. I'm sure they tried everything, but oranges work. But
Well, one thing about food, I just want to mention also about barbecue. From what I understand, it's not the Seminoles who made it, but the Spaniards and maybe the French too were so impressed with the barbecue that they found, like around the Mocama, around the coast, so the Timucuans had it. That barbacoa is evidently either a Taino word that the Spanish knew from the Indies or from the Timucua.
it's everywhere Spaniards go, anywhere they go, the first thing they see are natives smoking fish on the beach. Oh, that's it. And they smoke it. We know they're smoking it, not grilling it, because they use this big wooden raised platform called a barbacoa. And it sits about this high and it's made out of wood. So you're not roasting it medium rare because it would all light on fire. And so what you're doing is you're propping the fish up next to it and you are slow smoking. And that's how native cured meats, because the natives don't salt it and they don't eat it all at one time like a Spanish matanza, like they would do with a pig. And so when the mullet would run and they would net as many mullet as they could, they would slowly smoke it as a way to preserve it. Everyone who's on the coast, I mean, in the Outer Banks, Ralph Lane sees it, Columbus sees it in the Caribbean, Oviedo y Valdez talks about it in the Caribbean, everybody in Florida sees it. So Spaniards don't smoke to cure. They cure meat in ways that we know they cure meat. They make sausages and they make hams, and it's fantastic, but they don't cure meat in that way. And that's just the cultural tradition that they had at the time. And natives, they don't have, they cured using smoke. So like you said, the Spaniards bring the pigs, the natives are slow smoking on a raised frame. Voila, that's barbecue. He says it. He says, we barbecue pigs, the natives.
All right, so I've got a question from the Zoom audience, and then I think we'll have time for one more after this. So the question from online: Cabeza de Vaca was separated from other conquistadors and wandered through Florida for years, finally getting to Spanish Texas. What's his legacy?
I point to that. That's actually, I thought about actually saying that. I don't know how to do this best, so hopefully I don't hurt anybody by going back so fast. But here's Cabeza. So Pablo de Narvaez dies somewhere right around here. Because they land here and they say, we're going to have the ships meet us here, which has got to be like the dumbest thing you've ever heard, right? Because no one knows what anyone's doing. You're just going to like march for 100 miles and then just hang out the coast until the ships go by, right? They never go by, right? So immediately they're going to die, right? And they say that there's like 400 guys right around here at Ayut, which is just south. It's like St. Mark's. They're like eating their horses and they're building these ships and they push off. And right around here is where Panvilla de Narvaez floats out into the ocean and you never see him again. And that's the way he ends. And who is left is Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, who just happens, and this is to answer your question, the worst guy to have survived is the one that survives. Because out of like 350, I forget, 500 people, like 7 or 8 years later, 4 of them walk into Mexico City. Right? So just zoom out and look at a map. Could you imagine walking from Tampa to Mexico City, which is like somewhere around here? Right? It took them years and 99% of them died. But one of the 4 guys, and I actually talk about this in the book because one of the 4 that survives is Esteban the Moor, which means he was African American, which means he's like your first Lewis and Clark is actually an enslaved African man, right? It's incredible, the story. He survives. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca survives. And what is important about him is that he writes La Relación. He writes about everything. He wrote about everything. And he publishes it. And guess who reads it? Hernando de Soto reads it. And that's where he's like, these guys might have done it wrong, but you know what I'm picking up on here? Tons of natives all over the place. And this is where he gets his ideas. So yes, even though Pánfilo de Narvaez dies, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca survives. His letters survive. He writes them, publishes them, and that opens up a whole nother door of attempted conquest. It's actually incredibly important. That wasn't the word I was looking for. Yeah.
Sorry, and what did they go to Mexico?
What do you mean?
No, the administration was in Mexico City.
There was an administration. This is an interesting thing about Florida is that Florida didn't have its own sort of audiencia. So there was an audiencia in Santo Domingo down here, and then there's the Viceroyalty of New Spain. No one really claimed to control Florida because it had so little economic potential. It where?
Mexico City.
Oh yeah, so the Viceroyalty of New Spain would be the single most powerful sort of legislative group that controlled St. Augustine. It's the one that sent the money to St. Augustine, the Situado, every year, or it was supposed to be every 6 months. And so Florida was deeply connected to Mexico. It was supposed to be. In fact, everyone was always trying to find a way across Florida so that they wouldn't have to go around it, so that they could basically get. That's why they tried so hard to found Santa Elena, because they thought they could literally walk to New Spain, which obviously is insane, but they thought they could do it. He was just asking what the connection between Florida and Mexico was during the period, I believe, if I'm summarizing. Well, the journey of these gentlemen is that all the rafts fall apart and everyone dies right here. And then they slowly make their way down the coast. I mean, they make their way down the coast until they get to like it's past Galveston. And they're literally walking along the coast this whole time. And then when they get past Galveston, they're like, we're gonna die if we keep doing this. So then they basically take a right and move up. And I'm not as familiar with this part of the story, but for another 3 years, I mean, they basically wander in South Texas and what is now northern Mexico until they're run across by essentially a ranger guard from from the Sonora area, and they are brought in. And and they make their way. Then they make their way all the way to Mexico City from there. From that stretch to Mexico City, they're no longer essentially in danger, but they walk into I think it's like the Tabasco region or something like that in northern Mexico. So they make it right here. It's on rafts right there. All the rafts fall apart, walking along the coast all the way down to Galveston. Then they, unfortunately, if they had kept walking, they would have hit Veracruz and they would have made it, but they didn't. It's just like I don't remember what it's called. It's like one of the most amazing pieces of travel lore that you'll ever read. I mean, it's just a catastrophe. Any other questions?
A little related to the previous conversation about conversion. So I was thinking as you were talking, this sort of newer, well, it's a bit old now, but still from the 90s onwards, right, the whole new conquest history. And so thinking really seriously about the ways in which indigenous communities, especially in New Spain, but I'm curious what you can see in Florida too, continue to maintain their own religious and cultural identities within their conversions to Catholicism. And so this idea of, yes, they participated in New Spain, you have the whole kingdom of the two Indies, and they're able to separate themselves into these communities. But even in these sort of outposts of the empire, if you see examples or how you can think about how indigenous communities are able to maintain their own religious practices inside of their conversion to Catholicism and maintain that sort of balancing act throughout that.
There's maybe one obvious example,
Yeah.
and that's the ball game.
Yeah.
In Appalachia. And by the way, if you go to Mission San Luis, which is in Tallahassee, so you probably won't ever go there, you guys. But if there's Mission San Luis, and they have a Native American council house, which is clearly of Native American design, and it's of Native American origin. So you can see in some ways Franciscans making some concessions.
Yeah.
But the best example is the ball game. I had a chapter on the ball game. I had to cut it. If you wouldn't believe, this book used to be like 200 pages larger. So, they were just like, it can't be this big. But there was a chapter on the ball game, and the Franciscans absolutely hated it. They bet on it. It was bloody. People died. I mean, it's like a mix between like rugby and lacrosse. And they basically like put your hair up in a bun so no one can yank on it. And I mean, it is. And so the Franciscans, you have the Franciscan sort of administrative level would come from Havana, and they would walk through these regions and be like, what the hell is going on here, right? This is the most ungodly thing. And Franciscans like, Pareja would be like, yes, this is highly problematic, but if we try to remove this, it will blow up on their faces. Yeah. And I know that, there is, I mean, Franciscans were a lot more, I guess, willing to learn the language, to meet you a little bit halfway, but still the idea is that these are two incredibly mutual mutually impossible cultures.
Mhm.
But there are some instances like that
Yeah.
where the friar looks and says, we can put crosses all around the ball game area so that we can contain all of this evil, which is what they do. And they can try to press, but that's if you're looking for one example,
Yeah.
that's one example. And we just can't destroy this. We will have, especially after the Temuco Rebellion. I mean, they exist well into the 1670s and 80s, and they say we can't outlaw this.
Mhm.
It will go underground, absolutely, or it will just cause another rebellion.
It's a little question.
Talking about the ball game, I was curious. Who played better ball, the Edmondians around here or the Edmondians up in Tallahassee?
The SEC doesn't even play lacrosse, does it? Isn't the University of Florida beginning a lacrosse team? Have they? All right, fine. Well, the ACC plays pretty good lacrosse. That's all I know. I don't know about Florida State.
I understand that Dr. Gannon did research into the papers. I can't remember now which brief it was, especially in the Appalachia region, that finally got the King of Spain to issue a decree. And Dr. Gannon brought this to the president of FSU that said, the Indians of Florida are not to play ball.
I think, and actually, I think the story is, I think that sooner or later, I think they did ban it. To follow up to your question, I don't remember when that was. I know that it was ineffective. That, like you said, they still played it. Yeah, if we have time. I know we're pushing in time. But
We're going to go ahead and cut off here, but Dr. Kokomoor will be in the back selling books, so you are welcome to continue asking him questions.
I just want to close it out by again thanking Dr. Kokomoor for a great speech, very passionate one about a subject I knew nothing about. Thank you very much. But it does make me glad that I was Episcopalian or am Episcopalian, not Catholic. No offense to the Catholics in the room, but also I want to remind you, come back Saturday if you can. Join us for the Dashing Through History holiday function we're going to have. It's going to be a lot of fun. Promise sunny weather. It's going to be great. And also, Dr. Kokomoor is going to be available at the back. He's got copies of the book, which he will sign. And I'm sure there's a lot in there that he couldn't cover. My experience with book launches is that the speaker just scratches the surface. And there's a lot more in that. And so join him back there, and on your way out, see Will at Hancock back there, sign up for the event Saturday and become a member of the museum. Thank you for all coming.